The PlayStation 2 is my all-time favourite games console, and that general era of gaming is the absolute golden age for me. I've talked many times about the visual sweet spot we were in, where 3D models and textures weren't so low resolution as to need leaps of imagination to understand what the creators and artists intended, but neither were things so detailed as to explode development costs and production time, or completely remove everything charming from games. Then there's the gameplay. The norms of left stick to move and right stick to look had been discovered and baked into games, and many genres and titles had found what they were supposed to be as 3D games. But we were still in a very experimental time, full of exciting ideas and straight up gambles. Some of which hit, and others that didn't, and a few that just flew completely under the radar to get discovered much later on. The heavy hitters of the PS2's early years were no doubt Onimusha, Devil May Cry, Metal Gear Solid 2, Silent Hill 2, and a very big one for me, Final Fantasy X. These three games in particular are games I didn't appreciate anywhere near as much as I should have when they launched, and I've already done lengthy apology videos for these two, so now seems like a good time to go for the hat trick. Back when these games were in development, news of their progress was drip-fed to us through monthly gaming magazines, many of which came with DVDs glued to their covers that could be used to watch video footage from upcoming games and, if we were lucky, even play short demos too. The videos of Final Fantasy X were ones that I rewatched many times. I was surprised and excited by the voice acting, intrigued by the new, much deeper summoning system, and really taken by the bright and vivid colours that this seemingly tropical paradise of a world had been painted in. It was the complete opposite of Final Fantasy VII's bleak and depressing metal city of Midgar, and I was excited to finally get in and explore this world, and explore it I did. I went from Besaid Island to Zanarkand and beyond, and while I recall enjoying the battle system, especially how useful status attacks were, and how the initiative order could be manipulated through various abilities, I left the game with an overall lackluster impression. I found myself mourning the loss of an actual world map to explore, and while this game is rife with secrets and side content, the gap between that pretty terrible final boss and the insane power of the optional super bosses was so wide that, at the time at least, I just didn't want anything to do with it. Time moved on, and as Final Fantasy tried to break away from its fixed identity, becoming an MMO, and then trying to bring those kinds of mechanics into a single-player experience, a lot of other JRPGs followed suit, casting aside turn-based strategic combat for some hybrid or true real-time action system. The woefully underappreciated Lost Odyssey on the Xbox 360 was possibly the last game of this kind I'd play until I finally got around to playing Persona 5 on PlayStation 4 a few years ago. As such, I found myself looking back on Final Fantasy X with more and more fondness. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but maybe I'd been hoping for something else and had let my disappointment spoil the experience more than I should have. And so it is that, 20 years after its original UK release, that I finally sat down to revisit this old classic with eyes that can see it for what it is, all the good and the bad. So, since we're here, why don't we gather around the campfire just beyond the ruins of the ancient city of Zanarkand and listen to a story. This is Final Fantasy X. On the surface, Final Fantasy X is a kaiju story. The world of Spira is plagued by a seemingly invincible monstrosity known as Sin, and our band of unlikely heroes are embarking on a holy pilgrimage to obtain the only power capable of defeating it, albeit for a short time. Scratch the surface though, and we are embroiled in a much deeper and more tangled web that deals with the worst excesses of theocracy and organised religion, and of how those in power manipulate the masses to maintain a status quo that keeps them on the top of the pile. This is done by dangling the carrot of false hope before them to keep them obedient and docile, and ensuring they never dare question their rule. Meanwhile, our heroes get wrapped up in deep philosophical questions of the nature of life and death, a common theme for the series actually. Self-sacrifice and what it truly means to defy tradition, go against the will of the powerful, to really think for yourself about the nature of the world instead of blindly following doctrine that was spoon-fed to them from birth, and to live and die on their own terms rather than be railroaded by the invisible hands of fate or the will of powerful religious and political figures. It's a wild ride from start to finish, full of heartbreak and tears. The most annoying laughter.
You probably shouldn't laugh anymore.
Chocobos and tomberries and battles with monsters and robots. And it all starts in the science fiction utopia of Zanarkand. This is where we meet our protagonist and point of view character, the star player of the Zanarkand Apes, Tidus. Tidus? I always think it's Tidus. Maybe Tidus. As he heads over to the Blitzball Stadium to get ready for his next big game. Water is a big part of Final Fantasy X. The Zanarkand skyline is dominated by water flows controlled by some unknown power, and as Tidus makes his approach, fending off adoring fans and utterly failing to hit on these two girls.
Oh, if I score a goal, I'll, do this. That will mean it was for you, okay?
We also get the feeling that this kid might be living in someone's shadow, and that he might not be too happy about it. In terms of tone, Final Fantasy X really wanted to break the mold. The graphical improvements brought by the PlayStation 2 meant that cutesy stylized visuals were out, and real was the way forward. Well, not Crystal Chronicles, I guess, but that, as they say, is a tale for another time. So, if there's one place FF10 wants to show off how much it's matured, it's right here, in the opening Blitzball game. See what I mean about water? From here though, things escalate quickly, as an unimaginable power descends on the city, literally bending the fabric of space-time and affecting gravity as it does. Within moments, all hell is breaking loose, while a mysterious figure toasts the arrival of this monstrosity, as if he is greeting an old friend before running off to pick up our hero. What follows is our combat tutorial, and a desperate escape across a fiend-infested highway, as Tidus and this warrior known as Auron cut their way through the anarchy to arrive at the very eye of the storm. And from here, Tidus had better buckle up, because Kansas is going bye-bye.
It all begins here.
Final Fantasy X is an interesting take on the portal fiction or isekai genre. It's about someone from a science fiction utopia arriving in what seems to be a more primitive civilization. He isn't sure at first if he's landed in another country or on another world, but when he finally meets people he can communicate with, the first batch aren't so friendly, though they are not without their reasons for this. And when he mentions he's from Zanarkand, he's informed that Zanarkand is a kind of fabled city that was wiped out during a war that happened over 1,000 years ago. So our hero seems to have been displaced in time. But why is everything so primitive? Well, since the end of that war, the world of Spira has been plagued by an enormous Kaiju known as Sin. Not the most subtle symbolism of your name choice there, guys. That routinely destroys any large civilization, and the religion of Yevon that people follow now outlaws the use of advanced technology, claiming this is the reason sin was born, and that people must atone for creating such abominations as robots and powerful weapons of war, or sin will never go away. The toxins released by sin can damage the memories of people who get close to it, and serve as a convenient plot device for our boy Tidus here, as it absolves him of any eccentricities he may display, and even makes him sympathetic to other characters, even if he himself finds the excuse starts to sound very weak. Being an incredibly skilled blitzball player, he gets accosted by, and I shit you not here, the most popular Final Fantasy character in Japan, Wakka, voiced by the legendary John DiMaggio in English.
Bite my shiny metal ass!
Tidus is roped into joining the Besaid Aurochs, a floundering team to put it mildly, at a big blitzball tournament where Wakka is certain someone will recognize him and help him recover his memory. Going along with it, Tidus finds himself joining a new summoner, a girl about his age called Yuna, who is beginning a journey of her own, a pilgrimage you might say. Yuna is going to travel Spira and pray at every temple in hope of being granted the power of the final summoning, the only power on Spira that can break sin and bring about at least a period of calm. You can no doubt guess that things don't exactly go smoothly for anyone involved. Tidus is certainly not convinced that he simply hallucinated his whole life up to this point, and as danger besets the party and battles are fought, he finds himself drawn into a bond with the young summoner and her little entourage, and even discovers that he's not the first blitzball player from ancient Zanarkand to arrive on Spira. It would seem that when Yuna's father undertook the same pilgrimage, he was joined by a disgraced warrior monk named Auron, and a vulgar drunk who claimed to be one of the star players of the Zanarkand blitzball team. So it seems there is a great deal more mystery and intrigue here than we know. But with corruption within the very Church of Yevon and strange machines alike hunting the party, it becomes a race to find the prize and the terrible revelation of the price of the final summoning, and the truth of the so-called hope it provides. The format I used for Final Fantasy IX seemed to work well and meant I could delay talking spoilers until later in the video. So I'm going to go down that same road here too. The Church of Yevon is something we need to fully analyse to expose in order to properly examine the game's themes, and these are really important. But for now, how about we relax and go on a tour of sorts? Spira in many ways would be one hell of a vacation destination, and exploring it reveals quite an interesting history and culture. Several, in fact. Spira is a world that is shaped by two powerful forces. The fundamental life force of Spira, that can be seen manifesting as creatures called Pyreflies, and sin. The enormous and deadly Kaiju is the alpha predator on the planet, and its presence has shaped almost every facet of the civilizations that have risen up in this world. Wherever large groups of people gather and great cities start to develop, sin comes and lays them to waste, and the utterly devastating power it commands means that Spira is a world somewhat bereft of grand structures and vast cities. There are a couple of exceptions here, being Bavel, which serves as the seat of Yevon and thus the throne of the entire world, and Lucca, where the great Blitzball Stadium stands. The other big factor is Yevon. Spira is a theocracy, more or less anyway, and Yevon has a lot of rules about technology and machina. According to the teachings, the use of machina is what brought down the wrath of sin, though what god or greater power passed this judgment is never mentioned. Since machina was at the heart of the ancient war that destroyed Zanarkand, and sin seems to hate it, it means that Spira is, for the most part, formed of smaller communities of people who live without technology. Homes on Spira are not made to last. Only the temples of Yevon display any kind of permanence or grandeur. While most houses are small and built of materials easily found in the area, they can be destroyed quite easily, but they can be rebuilt in a relatively short space of time too. We are required to visit all the important temples as part of the game, and discover that at their hearts are strange shrines that contain powerful spirits known as Fayth. Summoners pray at these sacred shrines to be granted aeons that can be called down in times of need to protect them and wield devastating powers against their enemies. Another notable feature of Spira is that there is almost no war. There is only one faction, the Albed, who reject the teachings of Yevon, but they, for the most part, keep to themselves, choosing not to live in the towns and the cities of the rest of the world, and keeping to the seas and their homestead that we visit later in the game, albeit during a time of great strife. Given that it was war that supposedly brought about the wrath of sin, and the fact that people's lives are hard enough because of sin and all the various fiends it spawns, there's little space for people to be spilling each other's blood in senseless political movements to try to secure wealth and power, and Yevon certainly would not approve of such action. As we'll see later though, this world isn't without its own corruption. At the time the game starts, the people of Spira still remember the most recent calm. This is a period of time that happens after a summoner defeats sin in battle by calling the final Aeon. The last summoner to do this was Braska, who is the father of Yuna. He died in the final battle but ultimately broke sin and gave Spira a few years of peace before it returned. It seems like a steep price to pay for a brief period of respite, but it's something all the people of Spira hang their hopes on and pray for. It's why the Church of Yevon is so powerful. They do seem to, at least for a short time, be able to produce some kind of results. Spira has more than one race too. While humans seem to be the most common and widely spread of the races, there are quite a few others that we meet on our journey. The most notable are the Guado and the Ronso. The Guado live inside a giant tree at the border of the Thunder Plains. The Guado are the custodians of the Far Plane. All throughout our adventure in Spira, we encounter fireflies. These little things rise up and dissipate from every fiend we slay, and can be found everywhere at the sites of great battles and struggles. The ruins of Zanarkand are most notable for being full of them. On Spira they are closely connected with death, as that is usually the point at which they can be seen, but are in fact present all across the world at all times, just in a form that cannot be usually seen. Fireflies are linked to something fundamental in Spira, and come from and return to the Far Plane, all the while collecting and gathering the memories of everything they come into contact with. This has drawn comparison to them with things like Final Fantasy VII's Lifestream, and I find myself wondering if someone were to venture deep enough into the Far Plane, if maybe they'd find a crystal in there somewhere that's producing all these things. When people die on Spira, their life essence, stored within the manifested fireflies, is supposed to travel back to the Far Plane, but unfortunately, those that die suddenly or violently, such as those who fall in sin attacks, do not. Those that linger can seem to simply go on living for quite some time, but as they are not of the world of the living, they start to become melancholy, jealous, and bitter of the true lives that others have. The final vestige of this transformation is that they become fiends, and we get a first-hand look at the degree to which this corruption can manifest itself. To ensure that the fireflies cross over, a summoner must perform ascending as part of the funeral rites, at which point the energy will manifest looking like floating fireflies, and will carry the essence of the dead to the Far Plane, where they can... well, that's the big question, I guess. What's very interesting though is that the Far Plane can be visited by people, and they can even meet the spirits of their departed loved ones. Well, that's what Yevon claims is going on. As we'll get into later, there is a fundamental problem with faith and belief, especially when it has been handed to you rather than being discovered as part of a personal spiritual journey. That is to say, to accept one idea on faith, no matter how nice and happy that idea makes you feel, is to close yourself off to other possibilities about the truth of something. The Albed, for example, do not believe that what people see is the souls of their loved ones, but rather images conjured by the fireflies, who can detect the thoughts and wants of those who enter the Far Plane. I'm jumping ahead here, but I really admire Riku's refusal to enter the Far Plane, stating that her memories of those she loves are inside her, and she doesn't need to have them conjured in front of her. Indeed, how can you truly let someone go and move on with your life if you think you can just take a long hike or chocobo ride to Guado Salam and visit them anytime you want? The Guado take their roles as custodians very seriously, and come across as somewhat arrogant. Historically, there has been tension between the Guado and the other races, though by the time the game starts, much of that has changed thanks to the Guado finally joining Yevon, and one of their great lords, Jyscal, marrying and having a child with a human. This child, Seymour, though, well, he's going to be a problem for us all later. One of the largest structures on Spira is the Blitzball Arena in Lucca. It's quite interesting as some small amount of machina is used to help create the huge fish tank that the game is played in, and people clearly gather there in their thousands, and quite regularly too. Blitzball is the most popular sport on the planet, and one of the few cultural holdovers from the time Tidus came from. You might think it odd that people would risk gathering together like that, or even that Yevon would allow it, but it ties into a lot of the game's themes. Final Fantasy X is a story of hope and despair, of trying to make logical sense out of chaotic events, and about the way in which people react to tragedies and the uncertain nature of the universe, and try to give themselves hope that things might get better tomorrow. The Church of Yevon is one such expression of this, and Blitzball is another. The people of Spira live hard and, most often, short lives filled with loss. At any moment they could be attacked by sin, or simply fall afoul of any other particularly dangerous fiend. When sin comes, it doesn't just take lives, but homes and crops and safety, ruining entire futures and leaving the survivors with so little that they might actually well be better off dead. With things being so depressing, who wouldn't want to forget it all if just for an hour or so? Spira's Blitzball players and its summoners are its heroes. When the game starts, the stadium comes to life, and people can forget about their troubles and simply enjoy themselves. Enjoy being part of a team and watching them struggle and overcome challenges. They can cheer and shout and release all their pent-up rage and frustration. As such, the Blitzball Arena has a similar status to the Temples of Yevon, with soldiers and powers being arrayed to protect it at all costs from the destruction that could rain down upon it from sin or any of its fiends. Our pilgrimage across Spira lets us explore all manner of strange and wonderful places. As we travel the roads, we see the tips of ancient and long-buried structures rising from beneath the ground, or maybe we have to dance with death as we cross the Thunder Plains, rushing from lightning rod to lightning rod while dodging lethal bolts that descend from the sky. We ascend the mighty Mount Gagazet and meet the powerful tribal Ronso people, and we explore the long-destroyed ruins of Zanarkand, and that's before we even stumble into any of the game's secret locations, with all the mysteries and dangers that lie within. When Tidus was a child, he was always crying. Growing up in the utopian city of Zanarkand with a celebrity father might seem like a dream. No doubt his family was well off and the city provided plenty of luxury. Unfortunately, Tidus' father Jecht has a lot of issues of his own. While on the surface Jecht is brash and confident, and certainly he's physically strong and great at his game, he's also a mess of inadequacies and unable to deal with and communicate his emotions in any meaningful way. This flaw is something he hides from and leads to him looking down on his son and even lashing out when he's incapable of connecting with him. This doesn't make Jecht a bad person exactly, just one who really needed to eat a slice of humble pie and be told it's okay if he's not the best at everything. Still, none of that matters as Jecht mysteriously disappeared one day and left Tidus and his mother alone.
I was in a coffee shop running away from home when I heard the news. Our hero, Jecht, gone, vanished into thin air.
Given how bad his relationship with his father was, it's a wonder Tidus chose to follow in his footsteps. But as his mother became more depressed and distant at Jecht's loss, maybe the game was just somewhere he could hide from the harsher realities of his life, and doing so led to him rising to stardom himself. Unfortunately, his name meant he was always compared to his father, meaning that while Jecht was long gone, his shadow wasn't, and Tidus was never able to move on. Moving on may be a very big theme in this game actually, as we'll discover later. When Tidus is transported to Zanarkand, he doesn't exactly get a great welcome, first being attacked by fiends, and then later landing on the ship of some very hostile El Bed. He displays a good deal of resilience through this, and even flexibility and acceptance. When it becomes apparent that this isn't a dream he's just going to wake up from anytime soon, He simply chooses to go along with it, maybe even for a while almost believing the idea that his memory could have been affected by Sin's toxins, and hope it all makes sense later. He does a pretty good job of impressing and then later connecting with Wakka. He is likeable, and where Tidus differs a lot from his father is he's not guarded with his emotions. He can be a little big-headed at times, as we see from his game exploits, but he's also a great leader, and works to inspire and bring out the best in those around him, whereas his father was someone who preferred to hog the limelight for himself. To contrast this, we see later in the game that the reason Jecht disappeared was because he himself was mysteriously transported to Spira, and while Tidus found a way to roll with the punches and adapt, his father didn't do quite so well. But Jecht, like Tidus, found himself eventually joining up with a summoner and his guardian, and through the journey and trials forging bonds, eating that humble pie on more than one occasion, and finally finding something bigger than himself to live his life for, even going so far as to try and open up to Tidus via Memory Sphere later in the game. His success on this is...
Never mind, I'm no good at these things.
Well, it's an A for effort, I suppose. So, was it too little too late? Well, we'll get to that. As the outsider, Tidus does a good job of seeming to put his foot in his mouth, and finds it hard to accept the way things are on Spira. For everyone else, Sin, Yevon, the Sendings, and not only the looming threat of death and destruction, but the acceptance that there's nothing really to be done about it are just the way things are. Reminds me of another time travel story I once saw.
Stop! Well, what happens to them? Don't stand there like fatted cattle. Will you answer me? What is wrong?
There is nothing wrong.
It is all clear.
Tidus, though, similar to the Albed, finds it strange that no one would even try to look for a better answer, and he likewise has little knowledge of the pomp and etiquette of the old and powerful religion and its stupid hat-wearing elders. This makes him a great point of view character, since he often asks all the questions we find ourselves asking too, and gets frustrated with the way people behave just like we do. And while Auron is quite convinced this is his story, well, it's not just his. For a great deal of the game, it could be argued that Yuna is the main character. The pilgrimage that serves as the central focus of the game is very much centered on her, and Tidus is more just along for the ride. Yuna is a good person. She's not entirely naive, even though she is young. At the end of it all, the girl lost her father when he fought Sin, and judging by how expertly she performs sendings, she's no stranger to death and the pain caused by Sin, and her desire to fight Sin herself comes from her heart. She really does just want to help. She doesn't care for fame or fortune, and despite many chances to turn back, and even help Spira in another way entirely, she has set her mind on finishing her pilgrimage, receiving the final Aeon, and battling Sin, just for the chance that maybe she can give the people of Spira even a little respite. And as with all summoners, there is the small hope that maybe this time will be the last time. Yuna has never been seen or even seen herself as just a girl. Her companions, those close to her, are older, with Wakka and Lulu taking on the roles of big brother or sister, and Kimahri being this giant stoic guardian who only cracks a smile around her in their most private moments together. Her place within Yevon, especially once she becomes a full summoner, is one of reverence. People look up to her and see hope in her, which segregates her from society as a whole and places her in a position of great power. Fortunately, she doesn't let that go to her head, and always stays very humble. She is also very stoic, always putting on her best face for the public, and even in private to some degree. She rarely lets it be seen that she's angry, upset, or afraid, so it's kind of a big deal when she meets a cute young man claiming to be from 1,000 years ago, and he somehow slips through all her armor and leaves her as just a young girl, wanting nothing more than what all young girls want. Tidus may come from a completely different time to Yuna, but he gave people hope too, and had been elevated to a reverential status there. He helped people forget their troubles for a little while, so that they could come alive by enjoying the thrill of the game. Like her, he followed his passions where they led him, and they both have very famous fathers with very big shoes to fill. It's a big deal for Yuna to meet someone her own age who sees her as a girl and not as some symbol of hope. It allows her to open up and show her vulnerabilities to him, and when things get rough in the mid to late game, she really needs someone she can open up to. Romance in Final Fantasy is... well, I won't say it's Disney. It's a little more mature than that, I suppose, but it's very idealistic. Final Fantasy VIII had a high school romance, while 9 was a true fairy tale story of a princess and a pauper and a happy ever after. They are stories that don't deal with the realities of building a life together, dealing with each other's dirty laundry, and seeing people change as the world around you changes, sometimes even into someone you don't love anymore. That's not so important to these stories, I guess, and there's something precious in that naive idea of love and how simple it could be. I don't know, maybe I'm just a hopeless romantic. Not bad for a 41-year-old divorcee who had to end more than one emotionally abusive relationship.
She's cute, yeah? Don't get no ideas.
So let's talk about this guy. Because man, I love this guy. Even if he is a giant dumbass at times.
So the Albed are behind that. Those sandblasted grease monkeys.
The good of Wakka is that he's very positive, upbeat, and tough as nails. Considering he's played Blitzball his whole life and his team has never won a game. You think he'd be a little less optimistic, but that's to his credit. The defining moment in Wakka's life was the loss of his brother Chapu. Chapu was a young man who resembled Tidus in many ways, a fact that leads to Wakka bonding quite easily with the stranger from a different time. When the two were young, Wakka offered his brother a sword called Brotherhood, but Chapu favoured Machina weapons to swords, and would eventually carry a Machina weapon into battle with Sin. Chapu joined a faction called the Crusaders. Their story is quite interesting, given that they started as an independent volunteer militia, focusing on fighting Sin and Sin Spawn. They attracted so many followers that their power rose to rival even that of Yevon. But the Crusaders, not wishing to bring about war, joined with Yevon to create a combined force to fight against Sin. Chapu went to fight Sin as a Crusader and died in battle. And while I get that losing a brother isn't something you just move on from at the snap of a finger, this is where Wakka shows just how pig-headed he can be. Wakka is a devout follower of the teachings of Yevon, and truly believes they are the only way to save Spira from its current plight. So, grief-stricken as he was, rather than simply accepting that his little brother was a man who made his own decisions and reaped the harvest he sowed for himself, Wakka looked for something to blame. Scapegoating and the blame game are a big part of religious doctrines, as we'll explore later. In the case of Yevon though, it's Machina and the Albed. While Wakka's passion can bring out the best in him, it also brings out the worst. He unequivocally hates the Albed and Machina, and has never considered who or what those things actually are. He blindly follows this belief because it gives Chapu's death some kind of meaning. He doesn't see the Albed as complex humans with their own struggles, just as a plague that the world would be better off without. As long as he holds on to that, he doesn't have to deal with the harder truths of the world, but neither can he really let his brother go and move on with his life. Wakka's journey is very much in tandem with the party's wildcard and Albed, Riku. Riku is the Genki one. I can't think of another word that really works here. The direct translation of energetic or healthy doesn't really work either, but basically she's the overly positive to the point of being annoying, super loud and expressive one. So, you know, the other stereotypical Japanese girl. Think Yuffie in FF7, Selphie in 8 and Eiko in 9. Though Eiko is actually a kid, so I guess it's okay. Plucky. Maybe that's the word I'm looking for. I don't dislike Riku though. She's maybe a little too caricatured at times, but she's not without her depth. Riku is related to Yuna. They are cousins. Yuna's mother eloping with a Yevon priest was quite the scandal that got both of them in a lot of trouble and led to them being somewhat outcast from their own people. Riku and her uncle Sid, no not that one, this one, are both very worried that Yuna is going to get herself killed by following in her father's footsteps. So while she may always wear a big smile and always seem super excited about everything, in her most private moments we see that there's a lot of deep concern hiding beneath all that, and that she's doing her best not to bring the party down with her troubles. When Riku joins the group, her Albed heritage is kept a secret from Wakka, who sees them as a hive mind of wickedness, an enemy with no real personality traits beyond using machina, defying Yevon, and making everyone's life miserable. By the time he learns the truth of it, he's had time to get to know her, see her as a person, understand that she has a story, a family, and that she cares for people in her life in exactly the same way he does. Wakka still isn't happy, but the big dumb lummox does start to come around and see that he may have made a mistake in his earlier convictions. This is all expedited by the fact that the Albed help and even save them when Yevon turns against them, and by some severe tongue lashings that come from the party's black mage, Lulu. Lulu, Wakka, and Chapu have a long history together. Lulu was Chapu's girlfriend, and they all basically grew up together, so Lulu shares in Wakka's burden of loss. But she, unlike him, has coped much better. Sure, she has that dark, melancholy goth girl thing going on, but she has let Chapu go, and suffers Wakka's stupidity on the subject with a lot more patience than she might give someone she is not so close to. Lulu, however, is troubled by another loss. Something she truly blames herself for, and has come to play a huge part in her development as a person. Yuna, you see, is not the first summoner that Lulu has been a guardian for, and that first arrangement didn't exactly work out. Being younger and less experienced at the time, she was able to guide her summoner to the Calmlands where, apparently, many a pilgrimage has ended in the past, and took her down into the cavern of the Stolen Fayth. There they were overwhelmed by fiends and the summoner died, while Lulu barely escaped with her life. She takes responsibility for this and carries what she sees as a failure around like a massive dead weight, making her partial to sour moods and giving her a sharp and abrupt tongue. She is also very cautious and pragmatic, and she does not suffer fools lightly. Well, except Wakka. Kinda. She is very close to him, and cuts him a lot more slack than she does with most people. Which isn't that much really. With Yuna, she is very much a big sister, but she doesn't mollycoddle the girl, and holds Yuna's abilities in high regard. During an early mission where the Guardians have to rescue Yuna from Albed, she simply asks,
I hope you hurt them. A little.
As though she always knew Yuna was safe and capable of freeing herself. In the end, if one is going to fight a god-tier kaiju, one can't be wrapped in cotton wool. That just leaves these two. As we'll see soon, these gruff, stoic, old-looking men don't exactly fit in with the high-energy family unit formed by the other characters. I personally think Kimahri is a woefully undeveloped character in both story and gameplay. But this guy, Auron, well, he might be my all-time favourite Final Fantasy character. And I may need to drop a couple of spoilers if I'm going to talk about why. Kimahri doesn't really have a lot to say. To call him a man or Ronso of few words would be something of an understatement. He speaks only to those he has grown to trust, and then only when he has something of import to bring to the table. As a member of the Ronso tribe, he is basically a big blue cat person. No, not these guys. More like lion people, I guess. The Ronso live on Mount Gagazet, which acts as the final trial for a summoner on their pilgrimage to Zanarkand. They are a physically powerful and warlike tribe, hardened by the mountain and who constantly test themselves against the fiends that also make their home there. They have learned the fiend's way of fighting, also known as blue magic or enemy skill in other Final Fantasies. Kimahri is an outcast of his tribe, and while he is much bigger than even Auron, he's something of a runt compared to the finer specimens of his species. What he lacks in size though, he makes up for in spirit, never accepting defeat from the larger Ronso who bullied him, leading to Biran, a contender to become the next Ronso chief, breaking off his horn and forcing him to flee Gagazet in shame. The Ronso, however, are not quite as brutish as they may first seem. They respect unbreakable spirit even more than physical prowess. This is seen when Yuna comes to climb Gagazet and finds the entire tribe arrayed against her and her guardians. At this point, Yuna has been excommunicated from Yevon because of managerial disagreements. When she is challenged at the base of the mountain and refuses to back down, the Ronso step aside. It seems they share some of the old Greek philosophy that one may have their bones broken or their lives taken, but if they hold strong to their principles to the bitter end, they can never be said to have been defeated. This also comes out too when Biron and his best mate come to square things with Kimahri, and the smaller Ronso, now hardened from his journey and many battles, overpowers them both. While Biron seems prideful, he finds no shame in being bested by a more skillful enemy, showing surprising depth for someone written as a cardboard cutout of a bully at the start of the game. So I've given it some thought and I've decided to cut this section here. It's very difficult to talk about Auron without background on these characters, and since that takes us into mid to late game spoilers and ties in so much to the story of the game's enemies, this seems like a good place to end things. Be aware going forward that the spoiler gloves come off completely from here, so if you don't want to know all about the late game twists and turns, then skip ahead to the presentation and gameplay sections now. Sin is at the heart of all things on Spira. It affects everything from the building materials people choose when making their homes, to the weather and geography of the land. So great and powerful is this thing that even the ground on which we walk is shaped to some degree by it. Sin, however, is not the true villain of the tale. Not in the traditional sense anyway. To best understand Sin, we need to talk about these three. Before Tidus came to Spira, his father Jecht appeared here through means never explained, and he went on the pilgrimage with Lord Braska and Sir Auron to defeat Sin and bring about the calm. Of the three of these who set out, only Auron returned. We learn around the middle of the game that it is not the battle with Sin that leads to the summoner's death, but the actual act of summoning the final Aeon itself that drains the summoner and ends their life. They are in effect a sacrifice, which may explain how a disgraced priest who eloped with an Al-Bhed became a Grand Summoner. Sure, he might not be good enough to invite around for dinner and teach morals to our children, but he's welcome to die battling the literal devil of Spira and be remembered in statues. So what about Jecht? Well, again, around the mid-game we get this line.
Sin is Jecht.
So how did all this happen? The story of the creation of Sin deals with the war between Zanarkand and Bavel over 1,000 years ago, the truth of what the Holy Fayth are, and a summoner named Yevon. The Fayth are dreamers. They were once people who underwent a process to become these special dreamers. What they dream can be manifested from the Fireflies and a summoner. This is how we have these magnificent protecting monsters appearing to fight battles. Towards the end of the war, when it seemed that Zanarkand was lost, a great summoner named Yevon conceived a plan to spare Zanarkand. Basically, the people of Zanarkand would become Fayth, and he would, from their dreams, summon the city into being. This he would then protect in a near-invincible shell to keep the memory of Zanarkand alive forever. This dream of Zanarkand is Tidus' home, and the armor is the creature that is called Sin. Sin's armor is not without its weaknesses though, and powerful enough machina weapons could breach it, leading to the creature preemptively defending itself by attacking anywhere that has access to potent machina. It was Yevon's daughter, Yunalesca, having escaped the fall of Zanarkand, who sought to stop this with the first final Aeon, formed from her husband, and while the process succeeded in breaking Sin, the spirit of Yevon, now a mindless creature of instinct, took the power of her Aeon and began the summoning once again. This cycle has repeated for over 1,000 years, and is how Jecht wound up at the very heart of Sin. He's still in there in a way, still the same guy he was when he chose to sacrifice himself, but when he loses himself, he is nothing but an instinctual creature. So while Sin is our main antagonist, and confronting it is the critical point of Tidus' journey as a hero, where he will both reconcile with and free himself from his father's shadow, it is not a thing of evil per se. Sin is not willfully malicious or evil in intent. It simply is, and it cannot be anything else. You may as well call an earthquake or a hurricane evil, or assign intent to a meteor whose orbit just happens to intercept with a planet. Evil exists in contrast to good. That is to say, up only exists in contrast to down. Remove all the downs and you lose all the ups. To commit evil, one must know that one's actions will cause harm to others, and still willfully choose to commit them. To take it further, one must actively pursue the suffering of others, or at the very least pursue their own betterment, at the expense and suffering of others. As an instinctual creature, sin makes no definitions between right and wrong, but people can commit evil. And the more strength, influence and control a person has, the greater the evil they can commit, because their evil will filter down to everyone beneath them. The Church of Yevon is a con, and while there is hope to be found in its rituals and summoners, and comfort to be seen in the sendings and visitations to the far plane, it is all lies and false hope, malicious and terrible lies made to maintain a power structure, keep a status quo, and create an obedient and subservient race that is far too terrified to question anything it says or does, or anything about the nature of the universe and why things are the way they are. Cracking such a powerful and deeply ingrained ideology is going to take one hell of a fight. Luckily, we've got a fresh-faced summoner, a star Blitzball player from 1,000 years ago, and a very dead but unsent warrior monk who has one hell of a grudge to settle with Yevon. Now, to begin with, not everyone who follows Yevon or who even works within Yevon is a bad person. This is a well-written story after all, so it's not all caricatured and over the top. Most people in Yevon are actually good people. There are a lot of people who've simply grown up in a world not knowing any difference, and who are just trying to help to make sense of and ease the suffering of those around them. Likewise, while I am going to be talking about childhood indoctrination, again, it's not that everyone who preaches or teaches the word of Yevon is doing so with the intent of brainwashing people into obedience. Most of them are simply trying to guide people in the best way they know how. Yuna is a prime example of this. She is willing to literally offer her own life, even as young as she is, to give people just a little hope. Final Fantasy X is an exploration of how people deal with tragedy and loss, and the ever-looming threat of death. From Wakka blaming the Albed and Machina for his brother's death, to Yuna trying to become a girl her father would be proud of, and maybe even follow in his footsteps one day. It's about how people try to extract some kind of meaning out of a chaotic universe that doesn't seem to care, and about how that desire for hope can be ruthlessly exploited. Let's run a hypothetical situation here. So imagine a ship sails out to the sea, gets caught in a storm and sinks, killing everyone on board and throwing the families of those people into all kinds of extra grief and difficulty. Because of certain evolutionary traits, we feel compelled to search for meaning in that loss, to find some comfort, something that will make us feel safe again when the foundations of our reality have been kicked from beneath our feet. Maybe even hope that somehow, someway, we might be able to see the people we lost one more time, and that this time, things will be better, and we can all be happy. So, when some mystic with an even half-convincing story comes along and tells you that there's a big ocean spirit who controls these kinds of things, and that performing certain rituals will keep them happy, protect sailors from storms, and even take those lost at sea to a special magical place where they will be happy, you might be inclined to go along with it, just in case. Especially if, by chance, it seems these rituals get some kind of result. This is how people created gods, and on a small scale, these things are, mostly, harmless. What harm comes from a little comfort and hope, especially when no one can truly say that the Big Sea Spirit doesn't exist? Well, that depends on who's selling the hope. As people begin to follow the Big Sea Spirit, a power that eclipses community leaders and great warriors, the preacher gains influence and power, maybe even above that of elected officials, chiefs, kings, and even emperors. And if you've got that kind of power, first, it doesn't matter how benevolent you are. You're going to need to delegate some of that out, and you have no way of accounting for the character of every minister you ordain or official you have balancing your books. Corruption will seep in eventually. And as we talked about with Queen Braun in Final Fantasy IX, if there's one thing the powerful and the corrupt fear, it's change. Any change, anything that upsets the status quo, threatens to subvert their power. Were religions like Yevon genuine in their desire to help, then they'd operate more like therapists, giving people the tools to live a good life without their constant guidance, and turning them loose to find their own way, maybe just checking back in a couple of times of the year to see how things are going. Instead, they operate more like drug pushers, desperately hooking the young on their brand of hope, and working to ensure that they not only keep coming back for more, but are absolutely terrified to stop. Over time and generations, what could have started out with the best of intentions will have grown and mutated into a corrupt system of power that uses fear to control and manipulate people and keep them in their place. And what if that ideology were to spread to the whole world? Or what if it didn't even have good intentions to begin with? Yevon is a very convincing con. Its devil is a creature of the world. It turns up to attack homes and take lives regularly. Meanwhile, Yevon's summoners can call down literal angels from the sky to battle this beast and its fiends. They can heal the sick with magic, and through the sending they are seen transporting the souls of the dead to the far plane, where people can actually go to visit them again. It seems like an incredible deal, doesn't it? Protection from the greatest of all evils, eternal bliss after you die, and the hope that one day all of this will stop. All you have to do is sell your soul to the church. Stay in your place, obey the teachings, and never, ever, ever question or challenge anything about it. Entrust your entire life to Yevon. Let its maesters guide you. They know what's best after all, right? And they definitely have everyone's best intentions at heart, don't they? Yes, obey and serve. Suffer now for a reward when you die. I don't know about you guys, but something smells pretty rancid to me. Yevon also has its scapegoats and outcasts in the form of the Al Bhed. Since most people are born into Yevonite communities, they are fed the doctrine from birth. This in turn deprives them of the opportunity to go on their own journeys of spiritual discovery and make their own conclusions about the world. But if they did that, then Yevon would lose members, and members are the basis of its power. So instead, they are told that the world is a certain way, and the Al Bhed are held up as an example of what happens to people who don't toe the party line. If you don't believe and follow the teachings, you will be outcast. And remember, these are mostly small communities living without technology. They depend on each other for safety, trade, food, and shelter. Someone kicked out of the community would be easy pickings for the fiends and would be at the mercy of the seasons and the elements. They'd lose all their friends, and maybe even their family would disown them for fear of becoming pariahs themselves. And were they to die, their spirit wouldn't even be sent, and they would linger and become fiends. Yevon puts on a big front of speaking out against the Al Bhed and talking about ending the power of sin, but the simple truth is, Yevon needs both of these things to keep people scared. The Al Bhed are a great cautionary tale, and only need dealing with at times when they seemingly become too organized and start to gather in large numbers, such as at their homestead in the desert. If sin was truly defeated, Yevon would lose all its power. It might take generations, but without that fear to keep everyone in check, people would eventually start leaving Yevon and exploring other possibilities, and things would slowly erode. And the leaders of Yevon know this. The maesters of Yevon, with the exception of one, are both corrupt and hypocritical. The first of these we meet is Seymour, who becomes a recurring villain in the game, but we later meet Maester Micah, who in my opinion is much worse than Seymour. We soon discover that he is an unsent. That is to say, he is already dead, but his spirit has not been sent to the far plane. And why should it? Why should the rules, even holy doctrine, apply to the most powerful people in the world? Especially when those people know the doctrine is a sham. Micah and Seymour are very well aware of the truth of Yevon, sin, and the fallacy of the final summoning. They know that nothing is going to change, and yet they preach that things will if only everyone holds true to the belief. They decry the use of machina, something that may actually help them fight sin, while using it within their own temple. Why? Well, power, that's why. As a theocracy, the head of the church has unlimited power. power that can never be challenged. They have not been appointed, but ordained. And since that order came down from divine powers, they cannot be questioned. They will remain in power for as long as they are alive. And in Micah's case, even after that. Micah shows his true colors at a later point in the game when confronted by the party. At this point, events have conspired to cause unrest, and Micah's first question is,
why are you here? You must go and defeat sin quickly. You have obtained the final Aeon from Yunalesca, have you not?
All he wants is for Yuna to hurry up and kill herself to keep the people calm and in line, to present them with another martyr and a new calm so that he can continue his reign of power and control unquestioned. That's all he cares about. He is an utterly disgusting and reprehensible person. Seymour is a little more caricatured. He's a very entitled male, and his ambition to simply become Sin himself and destroy everything doesn't strike me as well-crafted motivation like, say, Sephiroth or Kuja have. He's a good villain in that he's incredibly entitled and dislikable. Early in the game, he proposes marriage to Yuna as a way to strengthen the connections between the humans and the Guado people. And when she tells him she'll think about it, he starts spreading the news that she said yes, and it's going to happen, as though what she actually wants doesn't factor at all into the equation. There's even a great set piece that involves the team rescuing Yuna from the wedding. Seymour himself is slain but not sent, and becomes more and more twisted with each battle we engage him in. As Final Fantasy villains go, he's kinda forgettable though, lacking the charisma and outright insanity of guys like Kefka and Sephiroth, and mostly just being a bit of a pompous ass that really needs a good bitch slap. The turning point for all this is in Zanarkand, when we start seeing the memories of the previous summers who came this way. We see that Auron began to doubt the pilgrimage, feeling his friends were throwing away their lives because sin always comes back. Auron is my favourite Final Fantasy character. I mean, okay, sure, he has all those traditionally masculine traits that I'm drawn to in heroes. He's physically strong, a little aloof, though not without a sense of humour, fearless in battle, and a lot more mature than the boys we see in 7, 8 and 9. He's also an outcast of his own clan to begin with, seemingly quite willing to question tradition and expectations, and he's an unsent.
I am also an unsent.
After Braska died fighting Sin, Auron returned to Zanarkand to challenge the spirit of Yunalesca. She waits here to pass on the knowledge of the final summoning to those who complete their pilgrimages. She herself is an unsent and very powerful. Auron challenges her and tries to fight her, but is struck down and ultimately dies of his wounds. But a potent spirit that isn't sent can linger, and one that is exceptionally strong can do so for a long time without becoming a fiend. Auron and Jack between them orchestrate Tidus coming to Zanarkand and joining Yuna so that someone can finally break the cycle and end this travesty. In Zanarkand, everything is laid bare. Lady Yunalesca explains that the tradition of the final summoning is a lie, something that provides nothing but comforting hope for people in the face of all this terror and loss.
This cannot be! The teachings state that we can exorcise sin with complete atonement! It's been our only hope all these years!
Hope is comforting.
And with all their beliefs finally shattered, and the very foundations of their world kicked from under them, the team is left floating in a void of despair. And
I would have gladly died. I live for the people of Spira, and would have gladly died for them. But no more. The final summoning is a false tradition that should be thrown away.
No, it is our only hope. Your father sacrificed himself to give that hope to the people, so they would forget sorrow.
Wrong. My father wanted to make Spiro's sorrow go away, not just cover it up with lies.
Sorrow cannot be abolished. It is meaningless to try.
My father, I loved him. So I will live with my sorrow. I will live my own life. I will defeat sorrow in his place. I will stand my ground and be strong. I don't know when it will be, but someday I will conquer it. And I will do it without false hope.
They are completely liberated. They are free to forge their own path, not follow one laid out for them by others since before they were born. You want to know why I love Auron so much? It's all summed up right here, as the plan he and Jack have worked so hard to concoct comes to fruition.
Now! This is it! Now is the time to choose. Die and be free of pain, or live and fight your sorrow. Now is the time to shape your stories. Your fate is in your hands.
Life is not meant to be lived in fear. We are not meant to blindly follow the doctrines of others. We are meant to live free, forge our own paths, and find meaning in our lives for ourselves. This is what forced belief denies people, what it takes away from children who are indoctrinated and taught to fear looking for their own way. And when we fight Yunalesca, we can see the true ugliness of false hope. In a way, this should be the easiest thing for me to talk about. I spend a lot of time on this channel gushing about the PS2 aesthetic, and seeing it brushed up to work on a HD monitor is actually one of my favourite things. Now, there's a lot of that coming, but this is also where I probably have my first real criticisms of the game. Final Fantasy X used the power of the PlayStation 2 to begin experimenting with the game's identity. And while we still weren't quite there for a true open world, they wanted to use the new tech to change up how the world map and exploration worked, especially in the endgame. This was probably the game's biggest miss, and why I left my initial playthrough feeling lackluster about it. I didn't really vibe with the change, and I was worried that this was the way the wind was blowing and that something was going to be lost. But let's start with the obvious stuff. Final Fantasy VII and IX were highly stylized games, and just like their pixel art forebears, leaned hard into the limitations presented by the technology to create a charming experience. Final Fantasy VIII dipped its toes in the water of the kind of realism we'd see in X, and that would go on to dominate the series from there. But it still wasn't quite there yet. While I can't help but feel a sense of loss around this, I also kind of get it. Final Fantasy is Squaresoft's flagship RPG, so of course they want this series to have as much prestige as possible. Both investors and developers want people to look at these games and go, damn, Final Fantasy is something special. Guilty Gear is probably another example of this. Not being much of a fighting game enthusiast, I stumbled onto this while I was researching cel shading for 3D characters. Arc Systems aren't just looking to make another game when they make Guilty Gear, though that would certainly be enough for hardcore fans. They're looking to push the limits of what's possible with the technology and set new standards that other games will have to chase. This is what Square Enix are doing with Final Fantasy. It would be absolutely enough to keep making more of what they'd always been making, or to do what they did with Dragon Quest and lean into a hyper-stylized look. But the brand, for whatever reason, demanded more, so here we are. The world of Spira is painted in bright and vivid colours. From the tropical paradise of Besaid to the magical Macalania Woods, and even the ruined city of Zanarkand, we see a variety of colour palettes and moods, but it's always vivid and beautiful. I especially like the dreamlike qualities of Macalania with its crystal pathways and fairy tale-like music. The characters likewise are quite the mixed bag of interesting designs. Outfits have this almost patchwork quality to them, with a lot of different things going on at once. Yuna, being a summoner, probably has the most conservative and recognizable clothes, with her outfit being inspired by traditional Japanese kimono, while Tidus just has... well, there's a lot going on here, right? The beauty of the PS2 era was we had characters and worlds that didn't need great stretches of imagination to fill in the blanks, but things were still relatively low poly and textures were still hand-drawn, with all the lighting information baked into them, more or less anyway. Now, I've no doubt that if I were to go back and play the original PS2 version of FF10 on a CRT TV, it probably wouldn't look as good as I remember it. Which is to say, in my memories, this is how it looked. Especially these summoned monsters. I remember being absolutely blown away at the sheer amount of detail on creatures like Bahamut and Anima, to say nothing of some of the more creative boss monsters and even Sin itself. Since I'm a journeyman of 3D art myself at this stage in my life, it's easy for me to see under the hood. I can spot how certain details have simply been painted onto flat surfaces, and while the HD remasters do a good job of making these textures look stunning, they also reveal a lot of hard and sharp edges in the environments which highlight just how low poly many of them are. At the end of it all, this is just an issue of bringing something off of its native platform, and Final Fantasy X isn't the only remaster to actually look worse in places for the sake of a graphical upgrade. It's kinda like how when they remastered all the old Jerry Anderson shows for DVD and Blu-ray, it suddenly became a lot easier to see the strings on the puppets. But none of that is really deal-breaking. At the end of it all, we still have an incredibly high quality port/remaster here on Steam and modern consoles that makes playing the game as simple as clicking a few icons, waiting for a download to finish, and pushing start. That's well worth the trade-off of having a few harsh lines here and there that don't break immersion. Another area where Final Fantasy X broke the mold was with the inclusion of voice acting for every character. This was always coming, I guess. Games like Metal Gear and Legacy of Kain had really set the standard for cinematic storytelling with the use of great voice acting, and only a matter of weeks after this game released would we also get our chance of hearing James McCaffrey's smooth deep tones rolling out of Max Payne. The only thing that had kept it out of Final Fantasy to this point was storage space. With a script as big as a game like this has, it just wasn't possible when the games were already spread over 3 to 4 CDs with just text. Even today, I shift between games with just text and games that are fully voiced, and the shift is always a touch jarring. I'm a reader anyway, so I'm used to finding voices for characters and imagining how their personalities shine through in what they say. Everyone in Final Fantasy X kicks out a killer performance though. I mean, you may remember I mentioned this guy. Now he's the game's gold standard for sure, but even Tidus and Riku, who have these highly annoying teen voices going on, are still great, and I'm never taken out of the game by a badly delivered line. The series voice acting would definitely go on to be a mixed bag, like a lot of what happened with the post-FF10 Final Fantasies, but other highlights include the bromance between the main characters in 15, while some of the low points... well, this game has issues. No, I don't want to talk about it. Give me another decade and I might try to visit it again. My biggest complaint though is in the level design. The world design is beautiful, really beautiful, with so many varied and wonderful places to go to, but there's also massive sections of the game that are basically just running along a straight road while being harassed by monsters that don't seem to be bothering anyone else on it for that matter. The game does its best to mix it up with chocobo rides and little mini games to make each area a little unique, but it still often feels like trundling along a railroad from point A to point B. When you do finally get an airship and a world map, it's just a graphic and a menu. Playing this now in 2023 with all the different RPGs I've played and seeing where Final Fantasy has gone, I don't mind this all too much, but back in the day, this irked me. I mentioned in my Final Fantasy IX video how much I love travelling the world map and secret hunting for all the little things dotted around. It's not that there aren't plenty of secrets to find, of course, but something was just lost by not having a cute little micro world to actually fly around and explore. Actually, scale is probably something else we need to talk about. Scale and suspension of disbelief. The micro worlds and the charming little graphics of the previous Final Fantasy games went a long way to selling the idea of them being world-spanning adventures, but I feel this is where Final Fantasy X, in its quest for realism, misses the mark somewhat. Okay, sure, it could be argued that things could be happening, maybe even entire days or even weeks pass between loading screens, but I don't exactly feel like I crossed an entire world by the time I get to Zanarkand. A great example would be the Calm Lands, which are introduced to us like this.
Beyond, there are no towns, no villages, only endless plains.
Many summoners stray from their path and lose their way here.
Woo, interesting. I wonder if this will become a game mechanic. Nah, you just walk from one corner to the other, fight some battles, and continue on your way. The Calmlands are an area with lots of side game content later, but I've always thought this particular moment was very jarring and took me out of the game a little. In the end, this was the first time, and it mostly hits. It does kinda suck that 9 marked the end of the micro world maps and the exploration hidden within them, but I also see why the developers wanted to break away and try something new. There are overall a lot more hits than misses with the presentation. The world is crafted with love and passion, and it was absolutely breathtaking to visit these environments back on the PS2, and still pretty damn awesome to visit them all again today. While some of Final Fantasy's identity was lost in 10, most notably the world map and stylized character designs, it still holds true to many of the series' traditions that have been around since the first game. Since I covered a lot of the general Final Fantasy stuff in my review of 9, I won't go too deep into the same territory here. We are still led mostly by the nose through 70 to 80% of the game, probably more so here than in 9, with our only real freedom being to grind enemies in an area to get ahead of the difficulty curve and to find the occasional hidden treasure chest containing a weapon or item that's got that little bit of extra kick to it for the part of the game we're in now. The story plays out like a movie or a book, basically up until the point that we have access to an airship, at which point we begin the lengthy process of farming endgame gear, grinding up to a level well beyond even the game's final boss, and digging through the world for extra snippets of lore or information concerning the characters. It's a tried and tested formula that's done well for the series and others like it since its inception, and it's perfectly fit for purpose here, with all of the wonderful presentational touches and voice acting provided by the PS2's power, making all those important beats and story moments hit all the harder. Final Fantasy X stands out amongst its peers though, in that it was the first numbered entry to not use a straightforward linear leveling system. It doesn't have a world map, at least not one that looks like the maps in the other games. It uses strict turn-based combat versus the popular active time battle system, and the difficulty gap that separates finishing the game from completing all the optional endgame content is a gaping chasm of busy work that would make even today's live service monstrosities balk, though there are some fascinating strategies to get around some of it, and mods to remove the sting of others. So let's start with things that affect the primary gameplay loop, and talk about combat, because this is some peak Final Fantasy combat, albeit interspersed with some peak Final Fantasy bullshit. So, to begin, I absolutely love this system, and I think this makes for one of the most deeply strategic Final Fantasy games that doesn't have the words tactics attached to it. It suffers somewhat from an endgame plateauing issue, where all strategies eventually become massively inferior to simply casting haste and then spamming quick hit with every party member. But until you reach that point, you're in for quite a ride. Final Fantasy X both made status attacks not only relevant, but really important to surviving many battles. Rather than debuffs being entirely the domain of black magic, they are now split up evenly between several characters, with Wakka dealing out more familiar blind and silence attacks, Auron using a variety of break attacks to break the enemy's armor, attack power and magic defense, Lulu using Bio to inflict continual and very potent damage to enemies, and Tidus affecting the turn sequence with haste, slow and delay abilities. This last one is incredibly important in breaking apart tougher enemies, and as I said earlier, eventually becomes the only strategy worth employing. There's a couple of monkey wrenches too. Riku's Overdrive, for example, can buff or debuff better than anyone, and early game, Yuna's null elemental spells are a godsend, especially given just how many bombs this game keeps throwing at you. God, I really wish we could skip through the inflating animation they go through every single time they get hit. The variety of strategies only deepens when combined with the party switch mechanic. Rather than only having access to 3 or 4 members for an entire fight or dungeon, Final Fantasy X lets you switch out one member for another on any turn, meaning you nearly always have access to the full suite of abilities of each member at any time, and a free supply of health and magic pools to bring into battles anytime. To offset this, monsters are quite challenging in their own way. Even at high level, Auron for example will have a hard time hitting a flying enemy, while Wakka can land hits on them more or less 100% of the time. Auron's weapons though almost universally have the piercing ability, meaning they ignore armor even without using the armor break skill. This makes him a perfect match against physically tough opponents. Fiend packs usually carry at least one elemental or magic based enemy too that Lulu is going to have to be responsible for bringing down. So you're constantly cycling through your big hitters and support characters, trying to find weaknesses in your enemies to exploit and come up with optimum strategies for bringing them down. And it only gets deeper when we get to bosses. Some of them anyway. There is some bitching to come, I assure you. One thing I've always taken issue with in Final Fantasy is how bosses are basically immune to status effects. This approach renders most strategies useless in favour of inflicting overwhelming damage as fast as possible, and leads you to ignore most of those spells most of the time. True, being able to pile up status after status on a boss enemy might be broken, but there are fairer ways to go about reducing the viability of these strategies versus simply blocking them. A boss with a high resistance to sleep or silence creates a risk-reward gamble of trying to get the spell to stick. A miss wastes a turn completely, while a hit could open up breathing room to heal or an opportunity to score big damage on an enemy. Fortunately, many of Final Fantasy X's bosses go down this second road, meaning that using scan and experimenting with different attacks lets you come up with a good strategy versus the old hit-hit-heal one that we often find ourselves resorting to in other series entries. This can have a huge impact on your enjoyment, as finding a smart strategy can make you feel very clever, and while a fight might take a little longer, you're on the back foot a lot less, and things are overall much less stressful. This very early Sin Spawn boss is a great example of how you need to bring all your members into the fight, cycle a variety of abilities, and use good strategies to break a much tougher opponent as it moves through different phases. Another really good example is Seymour. Well, this version anyway. I wouldn't exactly say I was underpowered approaching this fight, but I hadn't been doing any excessive grinding up to this point, and Yuna had been removed from my party for some time for story reasons, so she was a little behind the others on the sphere grid. My first blind attempt at this fight proved to be quite a slow grind, with me constantly healing characters and whittling down Seymour's health, right up to the point Mortis started healing him, and I found myself unable to do anything about it. The usual tactic in this case is to cast Reflect on the enemy so that the healing spells reflect onto the party, but I found myself unable to do that as I didn't have the ability. Before restarting the fight, I noticed that Yuna was only a few spaces away from getting Reflect on the sphere grid, and so ground out the AP needed to unlock it, and things changed a lot from there. By having a full measure of Seymour's power at this point, I realised several things. First, he could be hit with Bio, which would constantly damage him. Second, he only used magic attacks, such as the incredibly potent flare spell that he was one-shotting many of my characters with, which can be reflected. So, by using a combination of provoke and reflect, it was very easy to get Seymour to target Tidus with his flares, only to have them reflected back at him for massive damage, with further damage being inflicted by Bio. When Mortis began healing Seymour, I simply hit him with Reflect, so that the heals returned to my team, and voila! A clever and stress-free strategy to take down a powerful boss. There's a lot of late game enemies that can be wrecked with clever thinking like this. It may be a little slower than simply spamming high damage spells, but it conserves resources and is considerably less stressful. It's not always this interesting though, and since we're talking about Seymour, well, we can look at the very antithesis of the fun in this fight right here. I know his final form is considered by many to be his most devastating one, but this is offset by just how much you can overpower yourself before you ever face him. Seymour's gambit is to inflict each party member with the zombie status, and then cast full life to wipe them out in one blow, and there isn't any smart way around this. You cannot find or craft any zombie-proof items this side of Mount Gagazet. If you summon an Aeon, he can destroy them in a single turn, and if you set up things like Reflect to counter the full life spell, he can break everyone's protection in a single move. In the end, I resorted to simply charging up each of my Aeon's overdrive abilities and just going down the line hitting him with their most devastating attacks, before getting a very cheap Zanmoto when he was down to about 5k HP. Had this been any other Final Fantasy, I honestly might not have noticed, but in this game it really sticks out as a frustrating experience, and he's not the only example of this kind of bullshit. This dragon is incredibly broken too. It's supposed to be tactical, in that you can order the pilot of the ship you're on to pull away during the fight just before he unleashes a devastating attack. And for the early part of the battle, this actually works. Later though, they just decide the boss gets free actions, so it can close a distance with a move that damages the party by the way, and then gets a free move to use the attack you were supposed to have avoided by ordering the ship to pull back. This is offset somewhat by the great revenge moment when you fight a zombie version of it later. You may not have encountered any other zombie enemies before this point, but any Final Fantasy vet knows to keep an X potion back to basically one-shot any undead boss enemies that come their way. But let's get back to the good stuff. I mentioned items, abilities, and Aeons earlier. Final Fantasy IX had a fairly deep system of learning abilities, including passive buffs like status protection from equipped items. 10 has a simpler, more tried and tested method of each character only having 2 equipable items, a weapon and a defensive item. These items do not affect the character's stats, but they do provide an incredible variety of passive buffs. These can be anything from immunities to certain status abnormalities, with the coveted ribbon returning to protect you from everything ever, absorbing elemental damage, and even some outlandish powers like being able to turn damage into ability points via your overdrive gauge. Overdrives are super attacks that can be used when their meter is charged. At the beginning of the game, this meter charges when you receive damage, but a variety of conditions can be learned, such as the meter charging when you damage enemies or when enemies damage allies. Combine this with the overdrive to AP ability, and you're actually incentivized to have characters receive massive damage from the most devastating enemy abilities, so that you can level up fast as a result. And this isn't a hack. It's not something broken. This is very much by design. Like every RPG, weapons and armor, even rare types, can be found on the map, in chests, or dropped by fiends after battle. But the best items are made using the equipment customization system that lets you spend various items to add abilities to equipment, and this is how you can customize the more outlandish combinations that you need to really game the systems for the late game. A quick sidebar here. I mentioned in my Final Fantasy IX review how you only got to equip abilities in a reactionary way after you fought, or rather suffered, through some battles to see what the enemies hit you with. But in Final Fantasy X, you can swap out weapons and equipment on your turn, which is a real breath of fresh air, and one that I use to make certain battles a lot easier. So, to put it simply, Final Fantasy X's combat is straight up my absolute favourite in the series. I love its focus on exploiting weaknesses and the versatility it offers through character switching, and how even if you start a fight on the back foot, you can almost always maneuver yourself into a strong position and overpower any enemy. Its flaws, or rather the regular Final Fantasy bullshit, only stand out because they present such a contrast to how deep the rest of this system is. Oh, and then there's Aeons. It blows my mind that the developers and playtesters were able to balance this game when you can swap characters and equipment whenever you want. On top of all that though, they also saw fit to transform summon monsters from dazzling attacks with over-the-top animations into characters of their own that take over in battle when called. Their limitation is their speed and delay. A single Aeon still only has one attack, and unleashing their most devastating powers causes a longer delay, meaning they'll most likely get wrecked not long after doing so. But my god, these things are just devastating, and their overdrive animations are insane. The samurai bodyguard Yojimbo can even one-shot a super boss with his final attack Zanmoto. Even Odin couldn't do that in previous games. Where Aeons are especially useful though, is against any enemy of their own element, since they can absorb all of the damage coming their way and counter with physical attacks, or any enemy that relies heavily on status attacks like the dreaded Marlborough Bad Breath, because they're immune to them. This can lead to the development of deeper strategies. Late in the game, I kept Yuna on the back row, and made sure someone on the front row always had a weapon with the first strike ability equipped. This meant that if I did come across a Marlborough or some other cheap enemy like this, I could use my first free action to swap Yuna into the party and summon in a powerful Aeon like Bahamut or Anima to take care of the problem, and just laugh at this otherwise horrifically unbalanced enemy while it desperately tries to cope. Summon monsters can be upgraded individually, granting them boons and powers by expending items, but their attack power primarily increases with the summoner, and that goes up via the Sphere Grid. The Sphere Grid is one of my all-time favourite RPG levelling systems. In truth, at least at the start of a regular game, it's not all that different from any other linear levelling system. Later in the game, however, things really start to open up and get a little wild. Winning battles in Final Fantasy X grants you AP rather than XP, and sphere drops from monsters. AP allows you to move around the grid, and spheres are spent to buy powers from any node that is within one space of the character's current position. Spheres aren't universal though. If you want to upgrade your magic or MP, you'll need a magic sphere. Want to buy an ability? Then you need an ability sphere, and so on. Some spheres are much rarer than others, meaning you may have to abandon certain nodes or go farming before you can progress along the grid. On a standard game, each character starts on the grid in their class's area. Auron, for example, is surrounded by physical attack-based nodes, and Lulu black magic, etc. And there's a fairly straightforward path across the grid, or at least a clearly suggested route for each character. You can choose the advanced sphere grid option if you want a challenge, which will start with all the characters basically in the center, which could be pretty wild. Later in the regular game, when you've gone down the suggested path for each character, the grid really opens up, and you can not only start mixing and matching abilities and stats to create a very diverse and overpowered character, but also going after the most powerful nodes on the grid that are all locked up behind various barriers that need special key spheres to unlock them. The people who made this should probably work on pachinko and other gambling machines, because the light and sound effects on this feature are all very satisfying and give you a good dopamine kick every time you hear them. This in turn makes you very eager to farm up some more AP and spheres so you can get back onto the grid and continue moving your character along their journey there. The only weak point here is Kimahri. This giant blue Giga Chad doesn't actually have a path of his own to follow. Instead, he starts in the middle of the grid, with the idea being he can quickly venture out onto any path. This sounds good in theory, but really it just creates a fifth wheel type character who you only bust out as a last resort, or because you want him to get a share of the AP so he doesn't fall too far behind the others. It's a shame because he's also the blue magic or enemy skill user. This is actually one of the most useful powers in Final Fantasy IX, even if it is kind of a pain to collect all the spells for. But because it's Kimahri's overdrive, it has very limited use in this game. Still, I guess there has to be some complaints. Well, actually there's a lot. Like a fucking hell of a lot. You know what? I'm in a mood to bitch for a while, so why don't we talk about the game's side content? As I mentioned in the Final Fantasy IX review, gaining access to an airship marks a significant turning point in the game. You are now able to revisit, more or less, everywhere you've been to before, and begin the hunt for endgame weapons and items, and find all the obtuse little secrets these games are stuffed with, and Final Fantasy X is no exception. The world map is different now, but it has plenty of secrets to find and various ways to go about doing it. You can, for one thing, scan for locations at random on the map, and hunt down passwords scattered around the world that unlock locations for you to fly to for another. The highlights of this part of the adventure are easily the quest for the 3 optional Aeons, each of which have probably the most explosive and devastating attacks in the game, and Ramium Temple, where the Magus Sisters can be found, also being one of the game's most spectacular locations. Then there's the discovery and exploration of the Omega Ruins. This is an entire hidden dungeon, the likes of which would appear in paid-for DLC these days, teeming with some of the game's toughest enemies, a full story of its own, and a battle with a returning superboss, though Omega is small fry in this game compared to some of the monstrosities we come up against later. There's also plenty of hidden chests to uncover, and the monster arena that sees you gathering monsters from all over Spira like some kind of Pokemon trainer. This is similar to Final Fantasy IX's Chocobo Hot and Cold in that it's a fairly lengthy process that sees you trekking all over the world and grants you all manner of great and rare items, usually granted in large stacks to enable you to upgrade your weapons and armor with some of the more outlandish combinations. The main difference is where Hot and Cold was about as entertaining as having scorching hot needles inserted into your eyes and other sensitive areas, monster collecting is actually kind of fun. Collecting an entire set from an area will unlock a special super monster in the arena, even the weakest of which can be challenging for a party that's only interested in the regular end game. They are a great test of mettle, and a good way to see how much you are progressing as you begin to seriously overpower your party. So that's the good. Unfortunately, there's plenty to frustrate you and straight up waste your time along the way too. Now, everything I'm about to complain about does come with a big caveat. That is to say, it's all optional. You don't need to do any of this if you just want to finish the game. This is all extra for if you want an easier time fighting Jecht. He really ain't that tough. Or if you're intent on going after Nemesis, the Dark Aeons, and Penance. And I suppose you should suffer somewhat to get at those, but nevertheless, here we go. Blitzball sucks. I cannot stress this enough. It's a terrible half game that needs a skip option or a management mode, rather than making me suffer through game after game to extract the rare items and important things for Whacker out of it. It's a strange hybrid game that's trying to be both a fast-paced sporting experience and a strategic turn-based battle with menus and stats, and it spectacularly fails at being either. I'm not going to get into the meat of its mechanics, but I'd take a card game like Triple Triad over this any day of the week. I'd probably be willing to replay Chocobo Hot and Cold again than suffer through another Blitzball game. It is not fun at all. Its biggest crime though is how it's introduced to you. One of the early story threads is about the Besaid Aurochs and how they've never won a game, and how their captain Whacker is ready to retire after this tournament and focus on his monster killing side hustle. A huge emphasis is made on how Tidus is this big last hope for the Aurochs, and how this last tournament could be different for them all. When the time finally comes to play, the game grinds to a halt to run you through a lengthy list of tutorials that destroys all pacing. After which, the Aurochs are told they get a pass on the first round and don't even have to play. Hang on a minute. Why teach me the game, then not let me play? What was the point of that? For the second round though, rather than actually playing the game you've just suffered through a massive list of tutorials to learn, you instead have to chase the Albed around the stadium after they kidnap, air quotes, Yuna. This is to make a big deal about Whacker taking a pummeling in the game and not being able to play in the final, which is where Tidus comes in. So, when it's finally time for you to actually play Blitzball, you're one of the weakest teams in the tournament, facing off against one of the strongest. You still don't have a great grasp of the system yet because they decided to put an hour of regular game between the Blitzball tutorial and the first match. And to top it off, you can't even assign special abilities or mark players at the start of the game. So you just kinda flail about, not really knowing what you're doing while getting your ass handed to you so that they can make a big deal of Whacker returning to the match in the second half. Only thing is, it has little to no effect on anything, and you lose the game. The story comes to nothing, except maybe Tidus having a little humility to step aside and let Whacker lead this sinking ship to the bottom of the ocean. So, when it's all done, you just stare blankly at your screen and think to yourself, what was the point of any of that? It's one thing to fight and lose, it's another thing to not even get a chance to fight at all. It left me thinking the whole thing was frustrating and utterly terrible, with no desire to ever take part in it again. It's a huge time sink after all, and I can't imagine anyone wanting to add hours upon hours to their gameplay time just for the chance this might get better. This is not how you introduce a gameplay loop to someone. So yeah, I cried, I called my mum back in England and told her about it. She told me it was okay and I would always be very special to her, and from then on, I never played Blitzball again. It would have been nice if the remaster had let you skip games or just let them autoplay on fast forward, but whatever. Unfortunately, all of Wacker's best gear and overdrives are locked behind this time sink, so if you're looking to 100% this, well, you have my sympathy. Speaking of ultimate weapons though, they're pretty damn awesome in this game, but they are considerably more difficult to get than in any other Final Fantasy. While the weapons are not so tough to find, they are basically useless until they've been upgraded at a special forge. To access this, you need to complete a side quest and then acquire numerous items from around the world to combine with the weapons to fully unlock them, and a couple of these items need to be picked up before certain critical points in the story, or they're going to be nearly impossible to grab afterwards. A lot of this is pretty fun, and ties into other quests like the Monster Arena and the Summoner Battles that Yuna can have, but some of them are absolutely disgusting. The Sun Sigil for Tidus' sword, for example, is earned through this Chocobo racing game. The Chocobo training activities are, of themselves, actually quite fun, but in order to receive the Sun Sigil, you are required to finish the final race with a time of 0 seconds. Yes, I know. Let me explain. The course is full of balloons that when collected will reduce your final times by 3 seconds per balloon, but there are also birds that need to be dodged. Fast birds. Fast homing birds that are insanely fucking annoying and can drop out of the sky right on top of you. Not only does being hit by these things stop you, but it also adds 5 seconds to your entire time each time you get hit. So, you are looking to run the perfect race where you don't take any hits and collect every balloon along the way in order to get that 0 time. This is monumentally frustrating, as you have to be lucky with the balloon placements or this guy will just steal a ton of them, and no matter how good you are at dodging the birds, they can still just appear right on top of you and ruin your time. I scoured forums and guides looking for some strategy to deal with this, and it all came down to just keep at it for an hour or so. Once you've got into the zone, you'll get a lucky run and get it. And to that I say, how dare you? How dare you waste my time? How dare you think it's okay to expect anyone to suffer through that much bullshit over one item? How dare you disrespect my free time like that? At the very least, let me cancel out of the race the moment I see it's going bad. Don't make me suffer through to the very end and reread all the same text again to find out something I already knew from missing the 3rd balloon. To be clear, I went on Nexus Mods, downloaded this mod, and froze the timer at the start of the race, and I have absolutely no regrets about it, and the next time I replay this, I'll do the same again. It's one thing to spend hours fighting monsters to grind XP, gil, and farm items. It's another to spend hours on the chance things might go my way. This is why I don't play massively multiplayer online games. This isn't the only example of this kind of thing, but I think I've made my point very clear here. The PS2 era wasn't all gold-paved streets and rainbows. There's still plenty of good stuff though. There's the Albed language to translate, which is without a doubt the easiest second language you will ever learn, since it's grammatically identical and only the phonetic sounds are different. What are the chances? There are secrets to find from that, including locations and treasures, and plenty of places to revisit, and characters with extra things to say here and there. But we can't really talk about the side content in Final Fantasy X without talking about where it's all going, and that of course is the Dark Aeons. Unleashed after the halfway point of the game, these creatures are insanely powerful versions of the summoned monsters. Super bosses have been a long-running feature of Final Fantasy, representing the greatest challenges for the real completionist to overcome. Where the Dark Aeons differ though, is that first, you usually have to go out of your way to find a super boss in other FF games, but these things are very easy. Too easy in fact to bump into while exploring the world. Second, your average super boss can probably be brought down by around a level 60 to 70 party with a good loadout and a little luck, but all but the weakest Dark Aeons require a fully maxed out sphere grid, all the best weapons and armor, and if you're serious about fighting the nightmare that is penance, something I've never even seen in my game, you're going to need to max out that luck stat too. And that is an excessive grind all by itself. It really is a case of doing absolutely everything else first, or you don't have a chance. And even then you're in for a fight that'll take you about an hour to finish. I have nothing but respect for anyone who's felled this beast. Your patience and determination far exceed my own. I've always been fascinated with the game's super bosses, and they might even be the subject of their own video one day. Final Fantasy X was a turning point for the series. The PlayStation 2 gave developers the power to start crafting the worlds and characters they could see in their minds with very little compromises, and Square Enix took that line and did not look back at all. It was also the last Final Fantasy game to have true turn-based combat. X-2, a game I might cover one day, brought back the active time battle system, but from here on out, the series became highly experimental, and went down a road that basically turned FF16 into a full ARPG. Something I personally have no problem with, but the excessively dark tone, as though maybe someone had watched a little too much Game of Thrones prior to writing the story, isn't exactly my cup of tea. Certainly not one compared to the charming and colourful worlds of 1 through 10. Returning to the game long after its release, I am much more forgiving of its changes, and of the lack of the world map. I look upon it much more fondly than I did back then, but at the same time, I can still see why I was a little underwhelmed. It does have some really frustrating grind in places, and it can be hard to truly entertain the idea of maxing out the sphere grid to fight those optional monsters. The last battle with Yu Yevon is just bad as well. There's absolutely no danger of dying, so really, what is the point? What even is the in-game motivation for everyone suddenly having auto life on? Knowing that's how it goes does help, but it's still a very strange design choice. However, Spira is still a fascinating world with a lot to teach us. It is a colourful and vibrant realm of adventure and excitement, full of great and memorable characters, hateful villains, and one hell of a conspiracy to uncover. It teaches us a lot about simply accepting the way things are without question, without research. It probably hammers the religion bad, science good hammer home a little too hard at times, but it does show the good in these ideas too. As I said, not everyone in Yevon is bad, it's just that it's very hard to deny the effectiveness of its teachings and very scary to step out of line in a world like this. But still, lessons are learned, friendships forged and enemies bested. In the end, the dreamers must awaken and... well, I know this isn't exactly a spoiler section anymore, but my guess is all of you know exactly what that means. This is still a great and magical ride, and it holds up in 2023, and I really hope that younger Final Fantasy players take the time to explore this game and meet its characters, because it's all so fantastical. Hey everyone, welcome to the ending. I know the turnaround on these videos has been a lot slower than last year, but these games are so much bigger than before, and I've really wanted to revisit them and talk about them. I've also been working on various other things such as leveling up my sculpting and animation skills, reading the Wheel of Time, and preparing for what comes next. So if you're wondering if this slow turnaround was going to continue, well, yes. Yes, it is, but hopefully with a big payoff. Since this is all still very much a hobby, albeit one I can make a little money off now, I'm always interested in trying new things and exploring different niches, and since I'm very all or nothing when I get an idea, well, I'm going all in on what comes next. Probably. Like many of you, I'm sure, I'm also a fan of I Finished a Video Game and other creators who make longer multi-game videos. I've dabbled with the idea myself in my Legends series, but I wanted to find a series I could cover in a single monster video. And looking through my backlog, I found a series that's been sitting there for a while, and I really wanted to play. So the RPG ship is going to keep sailing, all the way back from 2002 until 2017, playing across several genres such as action RPG, turn-based tactics RPG, and open-world third-person adventure, as we explore every Divinity RPG. Now, this is a big project, and each of these games will need some time to complete, and there's always a chance I may get burnt out before we get there. There's also one outlier in the series that I may or may not skip for various reasons. At the time of writing, I have finished and recorded my capture for Divinity Original Sin. I've also written up a lot of my notes on it, and I'm now a good way through Divine Divinity, as I'm playing through the games in their in-game chronology rather than their release schedule. So there will definitely be content on those two games, even if I give up on this before the end. I'll try to keep you updated with posts and maybe a few shorts along the way. But hopefully, the next time we meet, it will be to gather around the fire and talk about the legend of Rivellon.